Chapter 11. Row 82 followed the creature who was carrying Kirana Sepharvaim down the cluttered halls of Zeta 28's Lab 3. His transportation contract had been to ensure that Zeta 28 received the creature and his hostage unharmed. Though they were inside her lab, he shrieked loudly and listened to ensure the lab contained the expected types and number of individuals. Being a new entrepreneur gave him a desire to ensure he had completely fulfilled his contractual obligations. Though he had not been a transportation contractor for very long, he was anxious to establish a reputation that he would complete his assignments correctly. The three-faced kidnapper carried Kirana's unconscious body through the halls, passing a number of strongman clones. They made no vocal sound, but seemed to grunt some kind of greeting to the kidnapper. Row 82 was uninterested in the exchange, but he was glad that he was not required to go through the authentication that he typically did when coming to Lab 3. They slowly walked through the halls until they arrived in a larger, more open chamber. There was a soft hum in the background. It did not take long for Row 82 to see the flickering energy field that trapped Lizard in a cell on the far end of the room. He was pacing back and forth. When he recognized Kirana in the arms of the three-faced kidnapper, his eyes grew wide and he stood still. Row 82 smiled faintly, seeing another Divine Key Guardian imprisoned. Her discomfort seemed especially sweet after having lost his lucrative contract with Epsilon 41 because of their assault on the Eastern Shrine. He avoided saying anything, though, as he did not want to upset his client. The treads of Zeta 28's tank base pulled her out of the shadows. Her head had a large mechanical implant with flashing red and blue lights. There were a number of scanners, sensors, and cameras attached to the apparatus. Her top was covered with a vest that contained a number of pockets holding various mechanical and electrical devices, none of which Row 82 could identify. He smiled pleasantly as she approached the three-faced creature and unconscious Kirana. "I am not a human customer, Row 82. She said in a flat tone. "There is no need to appear pleasant." She sounded like a machine. Row 82 stopped smiling. "Still, I wish to ensure your satisfaction with my contractual obligations," said Row 82. "Experiment 31, said Zeta 28. "Place the subject on the examination table and bind her." The three-faced kidnapper obediently tied Kirana to a table at the end of the room. "You should have learned by now that you can't duplicate me," shouted Lizard from his cell. Zeta 28 turned to face him. "In a sense, you are correct," replied Zeta 28. "Each of the previous 31 experiments have experienced unacceptable side effects." The lights on the apparatus on her face flashed. Lizard shuddered as he looked at the flesh of her face weaved with machine parts. "I would hate to think what an augment that moves on tank treads and has tubes going out of her face thinks is an unacceptable side effect," said Lizard with air quotes. "We have high hopes for Experiment 32, said Zeta 28 as she pointed to Kirana. The gesture confirmed Lizard's fears. Zeta 28 turned toward the three-faced kidnapper. "Thank you, Experiment 31, she said in the same emotionless tone. "You have served your purpose." Zeta 28 turned to Row 82 and nodded. Recognizing the implication, Row 82 pulled out a pistol and shot the three-faced kidnapper in the head. The creature fell to the ground with a thud. "You aren't gonna get away with this," shouted Lizard. "Row 82, said Zeta 28. "You have fulfilled your contractual obligations to my satisfaction. It was agreeable doing business with you." "I have verified payment," said Row 82. "Thank you, Zeta 28, and I hope you will consider my services should the need arise again." She nodded. Row 82 walked out of the halls, passing the scrutinizing eyes of the strongmen thugs. There were no grunts of approval. It seemed to Row 82 that they disapproved of him, likely because of what he had done to the three-faced kidnapper. To them, a brother had been killed. Of course, they were not allowed to question their master, so they did nothing to inhibit Row 82 as he exited the lab. As he walked into the warm night air, he gave a shriek and then paused. Straining his ears, he smiled when he found the area around his truck completely free. He opened his truck door and climbed into his seat. The engine roared as it started. He smiled and began driving away. He heard a loud screech of metal as he began driving and slammed on the brakes and whirled around to face the source of it. He saw a rail car slowing down. "Stupid rail cars," said Row 82 as he drove away. Of course, he had determined that when he was better established, he would see about expanding his business to the railcar network, but for now, he viewed them as competition. He drove away quickly enough that he did not notice the tall, white-cloaked figure leap out of the cart and point towards Zeta 28's Lab 3. Inside the lab, Lizard watched apprehensively as a series of tubes from the floor slithered around and plugged themselves into the table to which Kirana was bound. The table adjusted a bit lower in height to allow Zeta 28 to see Kirana clearly, and then rolled toward the augment as if it were an obedient servant. "You don't need her," said Lizard frantically. "You won't succeed." "I calculate that your assessment of my potential for success is not based upon reason," said Zeta 28. "Take what you want from me," shouted Lizard as an apparatus with several needles lowered from the ceiling above Kirana. "Just leave her alone." On the other side of the room, a table with several flasks was guided by the tubes of cables that slithered along the laboratory floor. The colored fluids in the various containers bubbled at different rates. Zeta 28 examined them carefully. She finally selected a test tube containing a clear fluid and picked it up and pulled the stopper from the top. "Please, Zeta 28, begged Lizard. "Don't do this. I will give you whatever you want." She placed the open test tube under a needle on the apparatus that seemed to hover over Kirana. The apparatus hummed for a moment as the fluid from the tube was sucked through the needle into a syringe that was attached to the apparatus. "Perhaps your offer would be more enticing if I were not in a position to take whatever I want from you already," said Zeta 28 as she placed the empty test tube back on the table with the flasks. "Stop!" shouted Lizard. The needle jolted down into Kirana's arm, and the apparatus hummed again, indicating to Lizard that the mysterious fluid was being injected into Kirana's body. He thought about how awful the multiple-faced kidnapper had looked, and silently prayed that Kirana would be spared a grotesque transformation. Kirana slowly stirred and then opened her eyes. She groaned. If her hands had not been restrained, she would have tried to cradle her throbbing head. She knew she had been repeatedly beaten so she would remain unconscious. Realizing that she was immobilized, she ignored the discomfort in her head and looked around for some method to escape. The sounds around her were muffled, but she slowly began to recognize voices. "Please," begged Lizard, "what do you even want?" "She will be designated Experiment 32, said Zeta 28. "I have made some modifications to the serum, and they require her to be conscious for the transformation. The preparations are very delicate, but they are nearly complete." A small burner ignited below one of the flasks on the table, causing the bubbling within it to increase. "Lizard?" groaned Kirana. "Is that you?" "Kirana," said Lizard. "I'm sorry." "There is no need to express sympathy, Ulysses," said Zeta 28. "She has the potential to become the most fit individual that has ever lived. She should welcome this procedure." "Fit?" said Kirana angrily. "I'm already fit, augment." "I calculate that when the serum is administered, you will be more capable of comprehending what I mean when I say fit," said Zeta 28 calmly. "I calculate that when I get out of this cell, I will kill you, Zeta 28, said Lizard with his air quotes. "Is that an attempt to mock me?" asked Zeta 28 with a slight smile. "I calculate that the odds of you escaping are less than the odds that Experiment 31 will revive himself." Zeta 28 pointed at the corpse of her failed experiment on the floor. Suddenly a loud crash echoed from the doorway where row 82 had exited. Standing in the open hallway with his swords gleaming in the fluorescent lights was Jonathan. "Jonathan," said Kirana in shock as she saw him. He stood so calmly in the doorway that she hardly recognized him. He looked almost majestic to her as he touched the mirrored key that hung about his neck, and his eyes began glowing brightly in the flickering light. The 5 thugs barreled through the passage, chasing after him. "Eliminate the intruder," ordered Zeta 28. They charged toward him. Jonathan moved fluidly as he dodged each attack. Kirana bit her lip nervously, watching him avoid punches, lunges, and kicks. She had taught him to strike the raised fist with speed to take advantage of attacks, but it seemed he was completely ignoring the principles on which they had worked for so long. There was no deflection or parrying in his movements. He simply dodged. Her eyes widened as she realized something about the timing of his movements. He was not reading and reacting to his opponents. He was preemptively moving to places where he would be untouched by their attempts to strike him. "Jonathan," whispered Kirana in amazement. His white cloak flowing after him made him look regal, and in spite of the danger, Kirana's heart raced as she watched. As the movements of his opponents became more desperate, he found opportunity for offense. Spinning about perfectly, he sliced through the thugs that exposed their bodies as they sought to protect their augment master. Leaping and spinning, he avoided a diving tackle from another of the strongmen and sliced him in half. He then spun around and decapitated the 4th attacker almost instantly. Rolling on the ground, he narrowly avoided the last genetically modified goon's attempt to leap on him and pin him down. Without looking back, he thrust his blade behind him, critically injuring his opponent. He then leapt towards Zeta 28 and pointed one of his swords at her heart, but stopped suddenly. "Very nice," said Zeta 28 calmly. "But how will you handle a hostage situation?" Kirana and Lizard noticed the needle apparatus above Kirana was right over her arm, prepared to inject her with some unknown fluid. "It is not possible for you to dispatch me before she is injected with this life-terminating serum." Jonathan's eyes glowed brightly as he pulled himself into the mind realm. His surroundings appeared to take on a familiar ambient blue glow. Kirana was still present and strapped to the table. He turned and saw Lizard in the cell on the other side of the room. Floating in front of him was a slightly more human version of Zeta 28, but with a large chunk of her head missing. "Don't worry about me, Jonathan, just kill her," said Kirana. Jonathan's jaw dropped as though he had been punched in the gut. "Don't worry about you, Kirana?" whispered Jonathan. "Why do you think I came here?" Lizard cracked his knuckles in his cell, pulling Jonathan's attention again. "Be careful, Jonathan," he said. "She's more dangerous than she appears, and she's manipulative." Jonathan turned to face Zeta 28. He gripped his key and his eyes glowed brightly. "What is in your syringe?" demanded Jonathan. "Experiment 32, replied Zeta 28 in her emotionless voice. "This treatment is a concentrated effort to master strength, intelligence, and speed. It is vital to establishing my fitness." "Experiment 32? asked Jonathan curiously. "There is no life-terminating serum?" "Correction," replied Zeta 28. "There is a life-terminating serum, but this is not it." "What is your plan for the life-terminating serum?" asked Jonathan. "The purpose is to eliminate the swordsman pointing his weapon at me," replied Zeta 28. "I have calculated the odds of him preventing the activation of Experiment 32 without being killed himself are well in my favor, thus making it a simple matter for you to re-administer your Experiment 32 serum after you have killed the swordsman," stated Jonathan, seeking confirmation. "Precisely," replied Zeta 28. "What action do you plan to take if the swordsman attacks you?" asked Jonathan. "If you die, you cannot test your experiment." "My regenerative systems render the most serious wounds as minor," replied Zeta 28. "I have already achieved a state of automated repair that will make me immortal. This is the reason I am now seeking the ultimate strength, intelligence, and speed." "The swordsman might decapitate you," said Jonathan, hoping to find a vulnerability. "I have calculated that the force required to cut through the alloy plating on my spine or skull cannot be sufficiently generated by the swinging of the swordsman's weapons, or any object in the vicinity," said Zeta-28. "I have also calculated the odds that the swordsman possesses explosives on his person as extremely low." "Alloy-protected vitals?" muttered Jonathan with a mixture of shock and amazement. "Correct," replied Zeta-28 in her emotionless tone. "What if the swordsman has allies?" asked Jonathan. His frustration with the augment was increasing. She had calculated a large number of possible outcomes, and reading her mind was not helping him reveal an exploitable vulnerability. "They possess explosives." "Allies will not be able to anticipate my control of the various tubes and cables in this laboratory," said Zeta-28. "I have calculated that the only impressive threat is the swordsman whose skills allow him to be evasive. All other allies are likely to be vulnerable to the same hostage situation, or become additional hostages, increasing the leverage with which the swordsman may be manipulated." Jonathan clenched his teeth angrily. She was right. He would be in a similar situation when Daniel, Sig, Victor, Lucas, or Jennifer arrived. Since she genuinely believed she had alloy plating on her spine and head, and regenerative abilities for other wounds, not even bullets would be enough to stop her. "In any case," continued Zeta-28, "I have calculated that once the disturbance has been stopped, I will be able to continue Experiment 32. "You're quite thorough," said Jonathan. "It is one of the aspects that makes me most fit for survival," replied Zeta-28. Jonathan clenched his fists. Then he remembered the life-terminating serum attack she intended to use against him. "From where will you attack the swordsman with your life-terminating serum?" asked Jonathan with a smile. "I do not know the location from which the attack will originate," said Zeta-28. "How can you not know?" demanded Jonathan angrily. "My head has been augmented with a variety of logic systems, to which I have issued commands to handle the attack," explained Zeta-28. "I only know it will target the swordsman precisely, and that the needle will enter his body at a speed of 340 meters per second. "That's too fast to evade," muttered Jonathan. "I have also calculated that it is unlikely such an attack can be evaded," confirmed Zeta-28. "There's no choice, then," said Jonathan as he took a deep breath. The blue ambience that surrounded him dissipated, and Jonathan returned from the metaphysical mind realm into the hostage situation he knew would greet him. His blade was still pointed at Zeta-28's heart. No longer was his augment opponent floating in the air, but resting on a set of tank treads. The hole in her head was now replaced by the flashing apparatus. He furrowed his brow as he saw it. This mindless machine meant that he would be unable to avoid the attack intended to end his life. She had been very thorough. He looked around for something else that he might use to his advantage. Finally he sighed. "Don't worry about me, Jonathan," shouted Kirana. "As if that's possible," said Jonathan slowly. He turned to Zeta-28 and lowered the sword that he had pointed at the augment. "It appears you have me," said Jonathan. "Stop, Jonathan!" shouted Kirana angrily. "Stop it right now!" Zeta-28 smiled. He lowered his head. "I just want to say one thing," said Jonathan. Zeta-28 paused for a moment, obviously recalculating the odds that stalling or that saying something might tip the odds in his favor. After a moment she smiled. "What is that?" asked Zeta-28 confidently. "You no longer have him," said Jonathan. He flung one of his swords across the room. Zeta-28 and Kirana twisted around to see the blade stick into the panel outside Lizard's cell. Sparks spouted out of the panel as the energy field that held Lizard flickered and dissipated. Zeta-28 spun back to face Jonathan, just in time to see him use his other sword to hack through the needle apparatus that hung from the ceiling, spilling fluids onto Kirana's arm and the floor next to her table. An instant later, a tube flung itself from the ceiling and jammed a needle into Jonathan's back. "Ugh!" groaned Jonathan as he felt fluid being pumped into his body. "Jonathan!" screamed Kirana. "Although you were about to die," said Zeta-28 calmly, "I must confess that I did not calculate that possibility." Lizard leapt behind her. "Calculate this," he said with air quotes. He spun around, kicking her in the face and throwing her off balance onto the ground. She began sending slithering tubes to try and grab Lizard, but he avoided them and grabbed Jonathan's sword, slicing through them with fury. Jonathan struggled to move, feeling his muscles tense up, but he could only pull himself beside Kirana's bed. She looked at him with wide eyes. "Poison," whispered Jonathan as he forced a smile. A tear rolled down Kirana's cheek as she watched Jonathan struggle to speak. "Leave. Quickly." Jonathan began trying to pry the cords that bound Kirana to the table up, hoping to free her. She watched in amazement as he fought through his own pain to help her. Lizard continued slashing at tubes as he got closer to Zeta-28. Chunks of tubing and cable flew in pieces and showered down around Lizard as he darted toward the augment. After a few moments, he buried the blade in Zeta-28's chest. Lucas, Jennifer, Sig, Victor, and Daniel appeared in the doorway. "We waited the 10 minutes you asked, Jonathan," shouted Sig as he rushed up next to Lizard and fired a few rounds into Zeta-28. After a moment, she stopped moving. "Doctor!" screamed Kirana. "Jonathan has been poisoned! Help him!" Daniel rushed to Jonathan's side as he pulled out his own mirrored key. Daniel's eyes began glowing as he worked. "You okay, my friend?" Sig asked Lizard. He nodded. "I feel a lot more okay now that I've given Zeta-28 a new piercing," he replied with air quotes. Sig laughed loudly. "We missed you," said Sig. Lizard turned to Jonathan, who had regained consciousness and was wincing in intense pain. "He saved Kirana," said Lizard, "and he saved me." "You would have done the same," said Sig. "He knew what was coming the whole time," said Lizard. "He did what he did, expecting to die." Victor approached Sig and Lizard. "I doubt he hesitated at all," said Victor. "Not even for an instant," said Lizard. Lucas and Jennifer finished cutting through the restraints that bound Kirana to the table. She leapt off and knelt down next to Jonathan, taking his hand. He looked up into her eyes and smiled widely. She shook her head at him as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. "Idiot," she said. "Indeed," said Daniel in a gruff tone. "You are very lucky I got to you when I did, and you had no way of knowing that I would be coming in with Sig and the others. For you to be risking your life like this, don't you realize how precious your life is?" "I'd say I was sorry," said Jonathan with a hint of a smile. "If I was." Kirana laughed as a tear rolled off of her cheek onto the laboratory floor. Finally, Kirana helped Jonathan up, and the group slowly made their way out of the lab. The light of the moons in the sky illuminated them as they walked into the empty city. While the lab had shelter, none of them wanted to stay there. There was something refreshing about the moderate air that, since leaving the hot zone, everyone seemed to enjoy. Eventually they found another building that had running water. Lucas examined it carefully and determined that it was safe. They each took turns drinking and then cleaning their dusty clothes. Jonathan, who had worked so long and so hard, went to sleep immediately. Kirana volunteered for watch, and Lucas joined her outside. Sig, Victor, and Jennifer went scavenging for food. Daniel walked up to Lizard as he had a drink. "What did she do to you?" asked Daniel. "I don't know," said Lizard. "I'm more of a scout than a doctor." "Did she operate on you?" he asked. "I can't say," said Lizard. "What are you getting at?" "I'm trying to make sure you're healthy," snapped Daniel angrily. He turned away and left in search of a bathroom. As Lizard was drinking, he suddenly felt his head twitch violently to one side. He tried to hold it still, but it felt as if he were being controlled. "Hello, Ulysses," said the voice of Zeta-28. He whirled around, finding himself alone, but he knew better than to think that was actually the case.